My brother took my husband on a collection job. They came back with panties in their things. When my brother said he needed my husband's help for a routine collection job, I didn't question it. It sounded boring, harmless, temporary. They left together like it was just another errand. But when they came back, something was off. Their stories didn't match. Their behavior shifted. And while doing laundry days later, I found something that didn't belong to either of them. Panties hidden among their things. I didn't accuse anyone. I stayed quiet and started paying attention. Small details surfaced. Nervous jokes, missing money, sudden secrecy. What was supposed to be a simple job had crossed lines neither of them wanted to explain. The truth didn't come from a confession. It revealed itself slowly, through inconsistencies and silence. And once I understood what really happened that day, I realized trust wasn't broken in one moment. It had been compromised long before. If this story helps you recognize when something isn't right, even when everyone says it is, please leave a like and subscribe. There are moments in life when betrayal doesn't arrive with a crash or dramatic confession, but through small inconsistencies that accumulate until it becomes impossible to ignore that something fundamental has changed. My brother Lucas showed up at my house on a Saturday morning, asking if my husband Daniel could help him with what he described as a simple collection job, picking up some equipment from a client who owed money to Lucas's construction company. Nothing complicated, just needed help transporting things. It sounded harmless, temporary, the kind of favor that family does without thinking twice. Daniel agreed easily. The two of them left together around 10 in the morning, and I expected them back in a few hours with a boring story about hauling heavy equipment and dealing with a difficult client. But when they returned 5 hours later, something was wrong in ways I couldn't initially articulate but felt deeply. Their stories about the day didn't match. Lucas said the client wasn't home and they had to wait for hours. Daniel said the client was there but was being difficult about returning the equipment. Lucas mentioned stopping for lunch at a Mexican restaurant. Daniel referred to eating fast food in the car. Small discrepancies that could have been just memory failures or misunderstandings, but that created a feeling that the stories had been coordinated but not perfectly, as if both were working from the same basic script but improvising details that didn't align completely. Their behavior had also changed in subtle but noticeable ways. Lucas, normally confident and talkative, seemed nervous and evasive, avoiding direct eye contact, leaving the house quickly after exchanging a few words with me. Daniel, who usually shared details about his day easily, was vague and short about the collection job, changed the subject when I tried to ask questions about how it had gone, seemed to want to end the conversation about that morning as quickly as possible. Both seemed relieved when we stopped talking about it, as if they'd been through something they wanted to forget or hide. Days later, while doing laundry, I found something that transformed my vague unease into concrete and disturbing suspicion. At the bottom of a gym bag that Daniel had used on the day of the collection job with Lucas, hidden under a towel and workout clothes, were women's panties. Black lace lingerie, definitely not mine in style or size, clearly belonging to another woman. They were clean but wrinkled, as if they'd been stuffed hastily into the bag, hidden in a way that suggested Daniel didn't want them to be found but had forgotten they were there. I stood in our laundry room holding these unfamiliar panties, my mind racing through possible explanations. The obvious conclusion was a affair. Daniel was seeing someone else, had somehow ended up with her underwear, had hidden them in his gym bag. But the timing was strange. Why would Daniel's affair somehow coincide with the day he spent with my brother? Had Lucas somehow facilitated or known about an affair? That seemed unlikely given Lucas's own nervousness when they'd returned. Nothing about the scenario made sense if this was just straightforward infidelity. I didn't confront Daniel immediately. Instead, I photographed the panties with my phone, documenting their location in the gym bag, then carefully replaced everything exactly as I'd found it. Some instinct told me that confronting without more information would just result in a prepared lie, a constructed explanation that would close off my ability to discover what had actually happened. So I decided to observe quietly, to gather more information, to pay attention to patterns and behaviors that might reveal the truth. Over the following week, I watched Daniel and Lucas carefully whenever they interacted, looking for signs of what they were hiding. And what I noticed was that they were both acting strangely, not just with me, but with each other. There was a tension between them that hadn't existed before, an awkwardness in their interactions that suggested something had happened that had changed their relationship. They were avoiding being alone together. Their conversations when I was present were stilted and careful, and both seemed relieved when family gatherings ended and they could separate. I also noticed financial irregularities that hadn't been there before. Daniel withdrew $500 in cash from our joint account the week after the collection job, something he rarely did since we usually used credit cards for everything. When I asked what the cash was for, he said vaguely that he'd needed it for some stuff, didn't elaborate, seemed uncomfortable with the question. I checked our credit card statements and found charges at a liquor store and a gas station, in a neighborhood we never went to, made on the day of the collection job, at times that didn't align with the stories Daniel and Lucas had told about their activities. I started asking questions carefully, casually, trying to gather more information without revealing that I was investigating. I asked Lucas's wife Maria if she knew what the collection job had involved, whether Lucas had mentioned any problems with the client. Maria looked confused, said Lucas hadn't talked about it much, seemed to think it had been routine and uneventful. I asked my mother if Lucas had seemed stressed about work lately, if there were problems with his construction business. She said he'd seemed fine. Business was actually going well. She didn't know of any particular issues with clients or collections. The more I investigated, the less the collection job story made sense. If it had been routine and uneventful, as everyone seemed to suggest, why the nervousness and the inconsistent stories? If there were no problems with clients or business, why the tension between Lucas and Daniel afterward? If everything had gone normally, why were there women's panties hidden in Daniel's gym bag and unexplained cash withdrawals and charges in unfamiliar neighborhoods? About 2 weeks after finding the panties, I was having coffee with my friend Sandra, who worked in legal services and had experience with various types of cases. I described the situation in vague terms. My husband and brother had helped each other with something, had come back acting strange. I'd found evidence suggesting something inappropriate had happened. Sandra listened carefully, then asked a question that hadn't occurred to me. When you say collection job, what exactly does that mean? Was it actually collecting equipment, or was it collecting money? Because those are very different things. The question hit me like a revelation. I'd assumed Lucas meant collecting physical equipment, because that's what he'd said. But what if collection meant something else? What if it was about collecting money that was owed, and something had happened during that collection that involved women and had crossed lines that neither Daniel nor Lucas wanted to explain? The scenario would explain the nervousness, the inconsistent stories, the tension between them, the mysterious panties. If they'd gone to collect a debt and had encountered a situation that was inappropriate or illegal or both. I decided to investigate this possibility more directly. I looked up the address where Lucas's construction company was registered, searched for any recent legal issues or complaints, checked local news for anything involving his business. What I found was concerning. Lucas's company had been involved in a small claims case about 6 months earlier, where a client had sued over incomplete work, and Lucas had countersued for non-payment. The case had been settled, but the details suggested Lucas's business had cash flow problems and that he was aggressively pursuing clients who owed money. I also did something I'd never done before. I checked Daniel's location history on his phone. We had each other's passwords for practical reasons, and I'd never felt the need to track his movements before. But now I opened the app and looked at where he'd been on the day of the collection job. The data showed that Daniel and Lucas had driven to a neighborhood about 40 minutes away, an area that was known for being economically depressed with higher crime rates. They'd spent approximately 2 hours at one location based on the GPS data, then had driven to another location about 15 minutes away where they'd stayed for another hour, then had returned home. Neither location matched any story they'd told about restaurants or waiting for clients. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to confront Daniel, but I planned the confrontation carefully, waiting until we were home alone one evening, having all my evidence ready, preparing myself emotionally for whatever I might learn. When I told Daniel we needed to talk seriously, I saw immediate wariness in his expression, recognition that something was coming that he'd been hoping to avoid. I found women's panties in your gym bag. I said directly, showing him the photo I'd taken. "From the day you went on the collection job with Lucas. And I've checked location data that shows you weren't where you said you were. And I've found unexplained cash withdrawals and charges in neighborhoods you normally never go to. So I need you to tell me what actually happened that day, because the story you and Lucas have been telling doesn't match the evidence." Daniel's face went through several expressions: shock that I'd found the panties, resignation that his attempts at concealment had failed, calculation about what he could admit versus what he could still hide. "It's not what you think," he said finally. The classic opening line of someone about to deliver a constructed explanation. I didn't have an affair. Those panties aren't from anyone I'm involved with romantically. But what happened that day? It's complicated, and it's not just my story to tell. Lucas is involved, and what we did wasn't entirely legal, and I don't know how to explain it without making everything worse. "Try," I said flatly, "because right now I'm imagining the worst possibilities, and unless you give me an honest explanation, I'm going to assume those worst possibilities are true. Did you and Lucas hire prostitutes? Did you assault someone? Did you participate in something criminal that I need to know about?" The direct questions, the worst-case scenarios laid out explicitly, seemed to break through Daniel's resistance to explaining. "We didn't hire prostitutes or assault anyone," Daniel said, his voice strained. "But what we did was still wrong. Still something I'm ashamed of. Still something that crossed lines I shouldn't have crossed." He took a deep breath before continuing. "Lucas's story about a collection job was true, but it wasn't about collecting equipment. It was about collecting money from someone who owed his company a lot, over $15,000 for completed work. The guy who owed it, Raymond, lives in that neighborhood you found in the GPS data, and he'd been avoiding Lucas for months, not responding to calls or certified letters, basically stealing the money by refusing to pay for work that had been completed." Daniel continued, his words coming faster as if he needed to get the whole story out before he lost courage. "Lucas asked me to come along because he thought having another person there would make Raymond take the debt seriously, would make it clear this wasn't going away. We got to Raymond's house, and he answered the door but tried to say he didn't have the money, that he'd pay eventually but couldn't pay now. Lucas got aggressive, not physically violent, but verbally intimidating, making it clear that we weren't leaving without either money or something valuable as collateral. Raymond's girlfriend was there," Daniel said, his voice dropping lower. "Melissa. She got involved, started arguing with Raymond about the debt, saying he'd been lying to her about where money was going, that she'd thought he'd paid for the construction work months ago. She was angry at him, was on our side basically, wanted him to pay what he owed, and she offered to give us something as collateral, something personal, to prove they were serious about paying but just needed more time. I felt sick as I began to understand where this story was going. "The panties," I said. Daniel nodded miserably. "Melissa said she'd give us personal items as collateral, as insurance that Raymond would pay within the next month or she'd be embarrassed when we came back. She went to their bedroom and came back with underwear, jewelry, personal things. She handed them to Lucas, told him to keep them until Raymond paid, said it would motivate Raymond to get the money together quickly because he'd be humiliated if we came back and showed those items to prove he still owed. It was bizarre and uncomfortable and wrong, and I told Lucas we should just leave, that this was getting too weird. But Lucas took the items, said it was legitimate collateral, that Raymond understood the terms. And somehow the panties ended up in your gym bag, I said, trying to understand the mechanics of how this had happened. On the way back to the car, Lucas handed me some of the items to carry because he had his hands full, Daniel explained. I shoved them in my gym bag without really looking, just wanting to get out of there and go home. And then when we got back to Lucas's truck, I grabbed my stuff and forgot that some of Melissa's things were still in my bag mixed with my clothes. I didn't realize they were there until days later when I was looking for something in the bag and found them. By then, I didn't know what to do. Throw them away and not tell you. Keep them and give them back to Lucas. Admit what had happened even though it made me look terrible. So I did nothing, just left them in the bag and hoped you'd never find them. The explanation was disturbing in ways that were different from what I'd initially feared. This wasn't infidelity, wasn't assault, but it was still deeply problematic. My husband and brother had participated in an aggressive debt collection that had crossed into bizarre and potentially illegal territory. had accepted personal intimate items from a woman as collateral in ways that felt exploitative and humiliating, had been part of a situation that was ethically wrong, even if it wasn't criminally prosecutable. Did Raymond ever pay the debt? I asked. Daniel nodded. About a week after we were there, he paid Lucas the full $15,000. Lucas gave the collateral items back to Melissa when Raymond made the payment. Except apparently Lucas didn't have all of them, didn't realize I still had some in my gym bag. So somewhere Melissa is missing panties that we took as bizarre collateral, and that I forgot to return because I'd hidden what happened from you. The absurdity and awfulness of the situation was almost overwhelming. Why didn't you tell Lucas you still had them? Why didn't you return them once you realized they were in your bag? I demanded. Daniel looked ashamed. Because admitting I still had them would mean admitting I'd brought them home, would mean explaining to Lucas that I hadn't told you what happened, would open up a conversation about that day that both Lucas and I wanted to forget. It was easier to just let it disappear, assume Melissa wouldn't miss them or would think they'd gotten lost in the chaos, avoid dealing with it entirely. The explanation revealed a cowardice and avoidance that was its own betrayal beyond the collection incident itself. Over the following days, I verified Daniel's story by talking to Lucas directly. I called my brother and told him I knew about the collection job at Raymond's house, about the collateral, about the panties in Daniel's gym bag. Lucas confirmed the story, sounded mortified that I knew, apologized profusely for involving Daniel in something that had gone sideways. It seemed like a good idea at the time, Lucas said miserably. Melissa offering collateral made Raymond take the debt seriously, motivated him to pay quickly, but looking back, it was inappropriate and weird, and I shouldn't have accepted the items or involved Daniel in that situation. I'm sorry. I also managed to find out more about Raymond and Melissa through some online searching. Raymond owned a small business that had apparently struggled financially, explaining why he'd had trouble paying Lucas. There were no criminal records or legal problems suggesting the collection had turned violent or illegal beyond the ethically questionable collateral arrangement. It seemed that what Daniel had described was accurate, an aggressive debt collection that had crossed lines into strange territory, but that hadn't involved the worst possibilities I'd initially imagined. But even though the truth was less catastrophic than affair or assault, it was still deeply damaging to my trust in both Daniel and Lucas. They'd participated in something inappropriate, had kept it secret from me and Maria, had been willing to let me find disturbing evidence without explanation rather than being honest about what had happened. The deception itself, the willingness to hide and avoid, rather than confronting an uncomfortable situation honestly, revealed character flaws that were troubling regardless of the specific details of what they'd done. I told Daniel that I needed time to process what had happened and decide what it meant for our marriage. The incident itself wasn't relationship ending in the way that infidelity might have been, but it had exposed issues of honesty and judgment and willingness to participate in ethically questionable situations that concerned me deeply. Daniel accepted this, understood that rebuilding trust would require time and changed behavior, agreed to be more transparent about his decisions and activities going forward. I also had a serious conversation with Lucas about boundaries and judgment. I told him that involving my husband in aggressive debt collection that crossed ethical lines, regardless of whether it was technically legal, was unacceptable. That if he had business problems that required uncomfortable solutions, he needed to handle them himself or hire professionals rather than pulling family members into situations that could damage their relationships and reputations. Lucas apologized, said he recognized the collection had been handled poorly, promised to use more professional methods for future business disputes. 6 months after the discovery of the panties and the revelation of what had actually happened that day, Daniel and I are still working on rebuilding trust. He's been more transparent about his activities and decisions, more willing to discuss uncomfortable situations honestly, rather than hiding them. But the incident permanently changed my sense of who he is, revealed a willingness to participate in questionable situations, and then conceal them that I hadn't known existed, showed me that his judgment and ethics were less solid than I'd believed. Lucas's relationship with both of us is also permanently altered. Maria was furious when she learned what he'd done, how he'd involved Daniel in an inappropriate collection and then kept it secret. Lucas has been more careful about his business practices, has hired a proper collections agency for future debt recovery rather than trying to handle it himself. But the incident damaged his credibility and our family's trust in his judgment in ways that time has only partially healed. What I learned from this experience is that sometimes betrayal isn't about the specific act, but about the willingness to hide and deceive that surrounds it. Daniel participating in an aggressive debt collection, while concerning, might have been forgivable if he'd come home and honestly told me what had happened, processed it together, acknowledged it was problematic. But his choice to hide it, to let me potentially discover disturbing evidence without explanation, to prioritize avoiding an uncomfortable conversation over being honest with his wife, those choices revealed character issues that were more damaging than the original incident. The panties I found weren't evidence of an affair or assault, but they were evidence of compromised judgment and concealed truth, and discovering them, investigating what they meant, forcing honesty that wouldn't have been offered voluntarily. That process taught me to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, to investigate rather than accepting surface explanations, to insist on truth even when truth is uncomfortable or complicating. My name is Sarah. My brother took my husband on what was supposed to be a simple collection job. They came back with women's panties hidden in a gym bag and stories that didn't match. The truth revealed itself slowly through inconsistencies and investigation. They'd participated in an aggressive debt collection that crossed ethical lines, accepted bizarre personal collateral from a desperate woman, then hidden it all rather than facing uncomfortable conversations. The specific truth was less catastrophic than what I'd feared, but the willingness to deceive was just as damaging. Trust wasn't broken in one moment. It was compromised by choices to hide rather than to share, to avoid rather than to confront, to protect comfort over honesty. And rebuilding that trust requires not just time, but fundamental changes in how we communicate about uncomfortable truths. Thank you for reading. If this story helped you trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right, please like and subscribe.